Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Sue Caldwell, who's a long-standing member of the Socialist Workers' Party and is currently living in Manchester. So Sue, take it away.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much, comrades. For some people, the question of the difference between sex and gender is really quite a simple one. There's a nasty coalition developing between various far-right and populist politicians, with the Catholic Church, with evangelical churches and so on, who argue very strongly that only sex matters and really everything else is gender ideology, this kind of bogeyman that has been invented as part of a campaign to turn back the gains made by women and LGBT plus people over the last few decades. They declare that sex is binary at birth, and just in case that's not clear, they legislate to try and say so. So we're going to change, we're going to ensure that everybody really understands this. In the case of Trump, they make sure that you can't even discuss gender in schools in Brazil, and in Hungary they simply pass legislation that basically erases any mention of transgender or intersex people. And by the way, when people like Bolsonaro talk about banning the discussion of gender in schools, they don't just mean transgender people, they mean all the theory and activism of feminists and people from the women's liberation movement going back to the 60s and 70s and so on. The entry point for these attacks is often an assault on trans people, specifically excluding trans women from spaces such as toilets, domestic abuse, refuges and sports events. But in this respect, sadly, there is a minority current within feminism that sides with the bigots. But we should see that this is also a much wider attack on women's and LGBT plus rights, and indeed anybody challenging stereotypical gender roles. And of course it's culminated recently in the overturning of Roe v. Wade, with further attacks on women and LGBT people in the pipeline, and attacks which will have echoes over here as well. And whatever our differences with others over the interpretation of sex and gender, I think it's important that we keep in mind who the real enemy is and why we need to, why it's urgent that we need to unite in order to stop these attacks. So let me start with the question of sex. Sex surely is very simple. You have an egg with an X chromosome, you have a sperm that can carry an X or a Y chromosome, they fuse, you have an XX or an XY embryo, they go on to produce a boy with a penis or a girl with a vagina. Really, this is all very simple. Actually, even at a chromosomal level, this isn't that simple. You get embryos that have only one X chromosome and no secondary chromosome. You get embryos that have an extra X chromosome, XXY chromosomes, and even the process by which that fertilised embryo then becomes something with external genitalia is not that simple either. Could I have the... Thank you. And just going to do a little biology lesson. I'm a bit intimidated by the presence of doctors here in front of me, and I haven't got very long, so I'm sorry. So, what's interesting, actually, both in terms of the development of internal sexual organs and external sexual organs, both of these start from a period of what is called sexual indifference, or bipotentiality, if you like. And so you have, in terms of internal organs, the gonads becoming either testes or ovaries, the development of the internal ducts, the beginnings of the vagina and uterus and so on. This is between about 8 weeks and 12 weeks of development. This process takes place. Up until then you have this sexually indifferent organs. And around the same process, especially once the hormones start kicking in and various other genetic processes, you also have the development of the external organs, again starting from a position of sexual indifference, the labioscrotal swelling, a name I've just learned, that can either closes up to become the scrotum or opens up to be part of the vaginal folds. I really realise that's an extremely simplistic description. But the point that I want to make in terms of showing the diagrams, apart from to say, by the way, that we do take the question of biology seriously and do think that it's real, we just don't think that it's our destiny, but we certainly don't deny it. But the point is that all of these things depend on a sequence of genetic and hormonal processes all kicking in at precisely the right time. And at any stage, a gene failure or some kind of variation can alter the most frequent pathways. And nobody is denying, by the way, that these are the most frequent pathways. And it also means that actually, when you talk about sex organs, it's not just about the final result that you end up and look at externally. You can talk about chromosomal sex, hormonal sex, gonadal sex, internal and external sex organs, all of which do broadly fall into two categories, but within which there is a lot of variety. The size of the organs, the level of the hormones, and so on. There is also mutability, by the way, because most of these things can actually be changed apart from your chromosomal makeup, which most people don't even know what their chromosomal makeup is. And also importantly, not all of these traits always agree with each other on what their sex is. Can you do the next slide? Sorry, I just wanted to get rid of that one, so I don't want you staring at that all the time while I'm talking for the next bit. So, they don't all agree with each other on what their sex is. And Anne Fausto Sterling, who I think is quite an interesting person to follow on some of these issues, a professor of biology and gender studies at Brown University, says, choosing which criteria to use in determining sex and choosing to make the determination at all are social decisions for which science can offer no absolute guidelines. Now, this matters very much. It matters very much for intersex people who often are born with mixed sex characteristics and are often operated on following a decision by a doctor that they should be classified boy or girl on their certificate, and then operated on, given hormonal treatment, clearly in a position where they're not in a position to give consent to this, so that they can fit with what they think biology says a boy or a girl should be. And actually, it's interesting that the work on gender identity, on intersex people, is actually what gave rise to the phrase gender identity coming into the mainstream, because it was they wanted to study, having we've labelled them boy or girl, how do they actually grow up to identify? And that was where the phrase gender identity really came into the mainstream. It's not just about trans politics, it's something that affects everybody. Slide, please. It matters for sport, actually. This is Maria Pinata. Maria Pinata, like all elite women athletes, had to carry around with her a certificate proving that she was indeed feminine. That says something in itself. In the 1988 Olympics, she forgot her certificate, so she had to go through another sex test. She'd already had one. It turned out that she had XY chromosomes, not XX chromosomes. Further investigation showed that she had internal testes. She externally, in terms of all of her bodily features, presented as a woman, identified as a woman, grew up as a woman. She was banned from competing. She eventually got her ban overturned on the basis that she had a condition called androgen insensitivity, which meant that basically her body was blind to the effects of testosterone. However, by that time, her running career had already been ruined. People will know probably more recently, most famously, the case of Caster Semenya, who has a different condition. I don't think we actually know exactly what her condition is, but we know that she naturally produces high levels of testosterone and so on, and other athletes that have come under similar scrutiny. It's quite interesting, isn't it? That is often black women's bodies who come under this kind of scrutiny and challenge. Although originally, actually, it also used to be a lot of East Europeans at the height of the Cold War. It used to be, these big East German weightlifters and things like this. But racism has always been in the background and is now coming to the fore. I'm going to come back to the question of sport later, but just in case anybody thinks that this isn't infused with racism, I'm going to show you a slide in a minute, which was presented in a presentation in 2012 under the heading Man and Women, Different Phenotypes, by the International Athletics Federation advisor Stefan Berman, whose work led to Caster Semenya's ban. And this is the picture that was used to, I kid you not, to depict this is woman, this is man. And I think this is some painting by Goya or something like that. So the question of sex as biology is neither simple, that's the point I want to make, and I also want to make the point that neither is it divorced from a society where how we present our bodies is scrutinised through the lens of both racism and sexism. Which brings me on to the question of gender. And here we are. This is a genuine picture obviously it's a stage picture, but these are genuinely these kids' clothes and toys. Somebody was doing some project on it or something. So having been labelled male or female, there they are, sent out into the world to learn what it means to be a boy or a girl and grow up to be a man or a woman. And this, of course, happens in all sorts of ways. The type of toys that people are given to play with, what sort of play they engage in, how physically active it is, how they observe other people around them, the reaction of others, what a pretty dress you're wearing, or be careful climbing up there, and all these sorts of things. And of course, the representations that people see in all various forms of media around them. This is really what people refer to when they talk about the social construction of gender roles. And I want to emphasise that this was an important contribution of feminist and socialist activists from the 1960s and 70s, when people refused to be defined by their uterus. And people actually started to look at the contribution of society, how things have changed throughout society. So, for example, anthropologists studied the way in which gender has been seen differently in the past, which also then implies that it can be seen differently in the future. People found out that actually some societies recognise more than two genders. The most famous examples that people probably know of are Two-Spirit people amongst First Nation American people and so on. Interestingly, actually, people also found that gender has not always been the most significant divide in society. There's a Nigerian anthropologist called Oyeronke Oyewumi who pointed out to the neutrality of pronouns, gender neutrality of pronouns in the Yoruba language. So they have the same word for he, she, it. And she argues that age is a much more important significant social signifier. And she says, if Yoruba intellectuals had constructed the original scholarship on Yoruba land, seniority would have been privileged over gender. There is actually another important aspect of gender formation, and that is of the individual's own sense of gender identity. And I talked about, in intersex babies, how did they develop in terms of having been labelled boy or girl? Did they grow up to feel that they were boys and girls? I'm just going to quote from Laura's book in terms of her explanation of, if people haven't seen it already, of gender identity. She says, for everyone, trans and cisgender people alike, our gender identity is socially constructed in a dialectical relationship with our material circumstances, including our biological sex. It is to some extent fluid. People's self-identification and self-description, including trans people's, can and does change and develop over time. There is a certain fluidity in this because our identities and sense of self are structured within given material, historical and cultural frameworks. And Fausto Sterling, who I mentioned before, has also done a lot of work on studying the development of gender identity. And she talks about, what people have the kind of conclusions that people are coming to with these studies, that all people, as I said, this isn't just about trans people, by the age of 3 have begun to be pretty conversant with culturally specific gender types and are able to label themselves as either a boy or a girl. And she talks about how this process develops over a number of years. She says the development of gender identity proceeds over several years. With time and familiarity, infants and toddlers observe culturally frequent tropes and record them in their rapidly developing brains. As a sense of self independent from parents emerges, toddlers associate their newly emerging independent selves with the culturally specific gender knowledge they are acquiring at more or less the same time. So I think that's another process that we have to add into the mix when we're talking about sex and gender. There's this kind of widespread understanding, I think, that a lot of people would have, that sex is about biology and gender is about society. I think there are lots of ways in which that often works as a general broad brush description. However, I do think that it's really important to consider within that the levels of variation, the levels of mutability, the levels of overlap in describing our bodies as they interact with the social world and develop a sense of gender identity. And actually quite a lot of people working in this field now quite often use sex/gender to indicate that interplay. One problem I want to argue with leaving biology as a separate kind of gender-free category, if you like, is that it allows a form of biological essentialism to develop, whereby biological differences between people with differently sexed reproductive organs are seen as the main cause of difference in behaviour between men and women. In other words, that the chromosomes and hormones must have the same effect on brains as behaviour as they do on genitals, and produce male or female categories and essences. There is, of course, no reason why chromosomes and hormones should have this effect on brains and behaviour. But that doesn't stop books like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus from becoming enormously popular. And you can see some spin-offs, some waffles, spaghetti. I haven't heard that one before, but you can see the sort of thing. These claim to be based in neuroscience, but really they're just perpetuating the stereotypes that people see in society. These arguments take various forms, look back at evolution and men becoming hunters and they had to be more aggressive and they had to take more risks and so on. Often the scientific explanation depends on testosterone or brain differences and so on. People might have heard of Jordan Peterson, a really obnoxious man, but unfortunately gets invited onto lots of talk shows and his books really sell tremendously well. He says that the gender pay gap is due to, quote, ineradicable differences, unquote, hardwired into male-female brains. And I want to quote from somebody who has actually researched male and female brains, called Daphne Joel, and what she says on the question. She says, although there are sex-gender differences in brain structure, brains do not fall into two classes, one typical of males and the other typical of females, nor are they aligned along a male brain, female brain continuum. We should shift from thinking of brains as falling into two classes, one typical of males and the other typical of females, to appreciating the variability of the human brain, mosaic. Now, of course, these ideas fit and they work and they sell books because they fit in with people's general common sense view of society and what they observe and how they see boys and girls. The expression "boys will be boys, girls will be girls," and so on. And there's even a feminist version of this, isn't there, which says that, if it had been the Lehman sisters instead of the Lehman brothers, the financial crash wouldn't have happened because the boardroom wouldn't have been filled with testosterone of all these men going out and taking huge risks. Although I think it's questionable the amount of risk that was actually taken by people gambling with other people's money and then getting bailed out by the government anyway. All of these studies that result in these sorts of headlines start off looking for differences. Differences in brains. There's even one where it's something to do with the ratio between your, I can't remember if it's first and third or second and fourth fingers, which is supposed to indicate how masculine you are or something. If you haven't read it already, Cordelia's fine book, Testosterone Rex, does a fantastic job of demolishing all of these myths, so I don't really have a lot of time to go into it. But interestingly, Cordelia Fine, Daphne Joel, who I just quoted on brains, and others, have argued that looking at some of the differences that do tend to occur in male and female brains, quote, sometimes one sex difference can compensate for another, in effect cancelling out each other to enable behavioural similarity. I think that's a really, really fascinating avenue of study, but of course men and women are equally good at packing wouldn't make such a catchy headline. Now, I've talked about feminism a bit. Now, of course, feminism is not a solid block. You have socialist feminists who may be involved in all sorts of working class struggles, radical feminists who generally do want to see radical change in society but maybe stress a bit more separate organisation. You have middle class feminists with nice jobs at The Guardian and the BBC who are probably less interested in societal change. Within those traditions, particularly within the socialist and radical feminist traditions, there are differences in attitude towards the question of sex and gender, and there are also differences in terms of the attitudes towards the inclusion or exclusion of trans women. And I think it's quite important to point to that, really. It's one of the reasons I don't particularly like the term TERF. Unless people are actually identifying as radical feminists who want to exclude trans people, but it's important to remember that there are a lot of radical feminists that actually don't want to do that at all. I'm going to quote from Catherine McKinnon, one of the icons of radical feminism, who worked a lot with Andrea Dworkin, people who in a lot of ways I wouldn't have a lot in common with in terms of our politics and how how society works and how it might change and so on. But she says this fairly recently: many trans women just go around being women. Who knew? And suddenly we are supposed to care that they are using the women's bathroom. There they are, in the next stall with the door shut, and we're supposed to feel threatened. I don't care. By now, I aggressively don't care. So, so the gender critical current is actually a minority voice within feminism, despite the fact that it is, of course, massively amplified by the aforementioned liberal journalists at The Guardian and the BBC, and indeed the more right-wing media in the Daily Mail, the Sunday Times, and the Trumpites, and so on and so forth. It promotes a form of biological essentialism, which we referred to before, in which women are defined by their genital sex at birth and therefore immutable. You can't literally go back in time and change that. And that this biological fact, rather than gender, is the basis of women's oppression. Sometimes they refer to the question of sex-based, what they call sex-based rights in law, which makes them sound a bit like, the Donald Trump headline that we saw in the first place, doesn't it? And deny that gender identity is a protected characteristic. Thanks. Thanks. So first of all, in terms of law, this is simply not true. This is from the Equal Opportunities Act, what it says about gender reassignment. You can clearly see it's about people who are proposing to undergo. In other words, you don't actually have had to have any kind of, biological changes and so on. It talks about changing physiological or other aspects of sex and so on. When they talk about sex-based rights, they're usually referring to a document written by transphobic groups called the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Rights, which is often cited as if it is in fact law. Laura Miles, in a recent article that she wrote in the International Socialism Journal, quotes the work of Sandra Duffy, an academic lawyer working in human rights law, who says that in international human rights legislation, sex is broadly understood to refer to include also the social aspects of gender. So it's not just that it's wrong in law and finding themselves in alliance with the right in pushing for legislative change or blocking progressive change. It's also wrong in locating women's oppression in biology. Because the first time we meet people, we don't usually see their genitals. What you do is you make assumptions about gender based on people's outward appearances, mannerisms, and so on, and how that matches with your experiences and society's expectation of male and female behaviour. And most of the time you might be right, but actually sometimes you might be wrong. On my way here to buy a cup of coffee in a little coffee shop up the road, I was twice referred to as sir by two different members of staff. And it's those assumptions, experiences, and expectations that underpin sexist behaviour. And when it comes to key elements of the state's oppressive treatment of women in terms of low pay, lack of childcare, healthcare, restrictive reproductive rights, and so on, these are very much part of the social aspects of gender construction. So I want to move on now to the question of what is a woman. And I want to start with these two quotes. One which comes from Simone de Beauvoir, one of the, often regarded as one of the founders of feminism and so on, one of which comes, frankly, from a transphobic organisation. The first one clearly refers to the social aspects of gender construction. The other is simply an attempt to employ biology to exclude trans women from the category of women. What would it mean for us to widen our understanding of the word woman to include trans women? In the first place, it would mean recognition. Recognition of the fact that there are people who did not have female written on their birth certificate when they were born, but who are now living as female. It would be an act of solidarity with those people. It would be an act of saying that they have the right to be included in every area of everyday life. And I also think it would be good for cis women, actually, particularly for cis women who get misgendered in coffee shops and who don't always conform to the stereotype of what women are supposed to look and sound like. That you can have different sorts of bodies. You can have a different tone of voice. You can even have facial hair. Who knew women have facial hair? And so on. And I knew that this would happen. Where has my quotes gone for Judith Butler? I don't know. I've left a bit of paper lying around somewhere. Here it is. Right. I thought it had bloody half an hour early as well. Look, and this happens. So Judith Butler, who I think actually recently has been writing quite a lot of interesting stuff about trans politics, she says, "We should not be surprised or opposed when the category of women expands to include trans women. And since we're also in the business of imagining alternate futures of masculinity, we should also be prepared and even joyous to see what trans men are doing with the category of men." What would it mean for... I just wanted to do a brief analogy, which isn't a perfect analogy actually, with the word mother. What does the word mother mean? Does it really just mean people who've given birth to children? We know that it doesn't. Would it be great if somebody followed around adoptive mothers saying, you're not really a biological mother, are you? You know, would that be progressive? Isn't it a good thing that the word mother includes people who aren't biological mothers? Well, I think it might be a good thing if the word women would allow the few people who didn't have female written on their birth certificate to be accepted as being a woman. What would inclusion of trans women mean for sport? Well, the fact is at the moment that we don't really know, because there are tiny, tiny, tiny numbers of trans women involved in sport. Leah Thomas, who made the gross error of winning a swimming race. It was a college race, by the way. It wasn't the Olympics or anything. She won the race in a time that was comparable with last year's winner. She came 5th in another race. She came 8th in another race. She broke no records. There was a swimmer called Kate Douglas at that meet who broke 18 records. I'm not aware of anybody rushing over and measuring her heart size or her muscle mass or whatever it was that they decided. The truth of the matter is that there is always advantage in sport. You know, Michael Phelps, huge arms, huge feet, double jointed ankles that everybody said acted like flippers and so on. The question is the advantage overwhelming? And there is no evidence of that at the moment. I think in elite sport, and I think elite sport is the only place where we should even be having this conversation, by the way. I think colleges, young people, amateur sport, just let people play, for God's sake, and enjoy themselves. Now, obviously at international level, the very, very top elite level, it's all about winning. You know, you're supposed to be all about taking part, isn't it? But it's not, it's all about winning. And, and therefore you do have these discussions. For me, the question is this. Is your starting point, how can we include trans women in this sport? Because if that is your starting point, then good, let's look at it. And it looked like that might be going that way for a while, didn't it? You know, that trans women have been able to compete in the Olympics in 2004 as long as they've been taking hormones and so on and so forth. The problem is if you start from the position of excluding trans women, then you say, what level of hormones do we want? Oh, that didn't work, let's half it. That's what they did with Caster Semenya. It's not about hormones, it's actually about puberty. And then before you know it, you've got a blanket ban. I think blanket bans are extremely harmful and wrong. At college level, this means in some states in America, a parent whose daughter is beaten in a race can challenge the winner for looking a bit masculine and insist that they have a sex test. This is just adding to the level of scrutiny that girls' bodies are under in society. It's going to discourage all women from taking part in sport. And of course, we know that it will be black women that are overwhelmingly subjected to greater scrutiny as a result of that. I think instead we should look at what are the barriers to women and girls' participation, pay, funding, and so on. Why is higher status given to sports that emphasise men's strengths? Why do we prioritise the sprints over the distance ones? Why don't we have more mixed events? Why don't we change the rules of tennis so a great big huge serve doesn't have such a difference, and so on and so on and so forth. Finally, before summing up, I just wanted to mention another thing about the word woman, by the way. That there is in some circles an argument about whether the word woman should be used in reproductive rights organisations because it excludes the fact that trans men and non-binary people would also require abortions and so on. It's not such an issue in Britain and Ireland, where in Ireland there have been trans men speaking at pro-choice rallies and so on, but there is a bit more of an argument in America. I think it would be a mistake. I think when I talked about the attacks on women and LGBT people at the beginning, the attacks on abortion rights are part of the attempt to roll back women's rights and force women back into their home and seeing their major role as child carers. And I think a woman's right to choose reflects that. And I think as long as the policy and the practice is clear, for example, if you went into a reproductive rights service, you would want to see maybe at least one poster that showed a pregnant trans man and so on. As long as the intention is made clear, I think it's right to point out that overwhelmingly it is women and girls who will suffer and sometimes die as a result of that. And I just want to quote an American trans activist called Julia Serrano, who some people may have heard of, and she says this: I personally have no problems with people talking broadly about female anatomy or women's reproductive rights, so long as they aren't purposely trying to erase transgender and intersex people in the process. And I think that's important, isn't it? So what is the intention here? The intention of using the word woman here is to exclude. The intention of people who are campaigning for women's reproductive rights is not to exclude, and most of the organisations that I'm aware of do have inclusive policies. So I'm going to So I'm going to sum up now, really. What's the difference between sex and gender? Well, my short answer is not much. It depends. It's a bit messy. Not much, because in everyday life, the terms are pretty interchangeable, aren't they? You don't, when you have a conversation with someone, you don't usually go, oh, do you really mean sex there? Or do you really mean gender? You kind of know what people mean. In legislation, as we've seen in forms, sometimes a form will say, what's your sex? Sometimes it will say, what's your gender? They mean the same thing, really. It depends, because of course, the biology of sex is real and sometimes overwhelmingly important. If you're a doctor, if you're involved in medical practice, although even then we should be aware of the aspect of sexism and racism involved in that. Witness the high rates, the high rates of maternity mortality amongst black women and so on. But usually the people who are stressing the importance of biology are not doctors. They are people who are doing it in order to either justify existing stereotypes like the Mars-Venus people, or to exclude trans and intersex women. So as I said before, the idea of sex as biology, gender as socially constructed is useful if you really, really, really need to differentiate. But you need to understand within that the level of variance, of mutability, of interplay between the characters and the internalised meaning of gender as gender identity. And what's really exciting and interesting at the moment, I think, is that there are lots of feminist and socialist writers and scientists engaging with this. We don't always agree with everything they say, the way that they use class. A lot of feminists often refer to women as class in a hierarchical relationship with men and so on, whereas for us the exploitation of working class is at the heart of women's oppression through its reliance on the nuclear family to produce future generations of workers. And it's important that we centre our analysis of policing our bodies and sexualities within that, and that also means that our focus is on class politics and we reject the identity politics and so on. I don't have time to go into it. I think it's important that we engage with people in developing these analyses in the field from a position of solidarity to stop the attacks on women and LGBT plus people that I started off with, and I hope that this discussion will contribute to the development of that analysis. Thank you.
I promise I won't go over time, but I'd like to talk about gender roles in the context of this inter-imperialist war that we're experiencing. At the Polish border, which I've been to 4 times, human trafficking is a huge problem, and it leads to the gross sexual exploitation of women. But there's an interesting kind of dystopian dynamic where, because military-age males are not allowed to leave Ukraine, and women and children are, I've been to the border and seen the scene, like out of a film, something like that, where men are weeping at the border as they say goodbye to their families, and it's really horrifying to see. But this inter-imperialist war, it reifies these gender roles where somehow, men stay home, they're the heroes, women are the victims, and they have to flee. But at the same time, legally, you are either male or female, right? This determines whether or not you can leave the country legally. And as a result, men are forced to try to sneak out of Ukraine, especially if they're not doing anything related to defense. Maybe they're in IT, and then the men who are out abroad, they can't go back into Ukraine, because if they stay there, then they can't come back out again. And younger girls, they don't leave Ukraine because they don't want to be separated from their male partners. And so it's creating all these dynamics. One more point, military weddings are highly glamorized on social media feeds, and you've got these like stark images of a beautiful woman, heroic, muscular man. But same-sex military weddings don't receive the same attention or glamorization on social media. So all of this, these gender roles, they feed into, let's say, imperialist propaganda. And war reifies traditional gender roles, male chauvinism, toxic masculinity, and I'm sure that this can be connected to the market too. So these are just some things.
Thank you, comrade. I'm going to take the comrade at the end of the row, and then I'll take the comrade in the middle there, if that's okay.
Hi, me and my colleague have been discussing, and we're trying to work. What we'd like to know is what really would be the effect if we didn't force the stereotypes of male and female from birth. I mean, it's unfair. How do we know? For starters, we feel that it would need a massive societal shift. Yes, but what we'd like to know is, would that be a good thing?
Thank you, comrade. So I'd like to take the comrade there, and then followed by the comrade in the team t-shirt.
Okay, I want to tell a personal story as a GP about how I think that although the position of trans now is very much in the news and it's under attack and so on and so forth, how in real life I think there's been a movement where this is, where things are actually getting easier and better. I remember when I was sitting at a BMA meeting in BMA House down there, in central London, and the chair, who was the kind of full-time paid BMA GP to look after all the GPs in London, got up and said to me, I've got to go halfway through this meeting because I've got to go and see my psychologist. I said, why are you going to see your psychologist? And he says, because I'm gender transitioning and I need to see the psychologist as part of the whole process. So I said, all right, I said his male name because that was what he was then, and took over the chair and so on. And then she did transition, and on that committee, the Central GPs Committee, there was a lot of hostility from a lot of GPs who said, how can we have someone going negotiating with Central London who will bring the profession into disrepute in this kind of way? And we had a battle on that committee because there was nearly a vote of no confidence in her, and we won it, and that was good. And gradually, I think, and she actually did the clever thing, which she went to all the GP press and did an interview and came out and put her position in the open straight away and got very favourable publicity there rather than being outed by the Mail or the... in fact, the Mail then did a very good spread on her because she got her story out first, which I think is always the way to go if you can. And now, looking at the situation, say, in Tower Hamlets, we had a different person who was a very well-respected GP, who was very, very popular, who has been out for a long time from the start, and we didn't have to fight those battles. So I think that things have moved on, however difficult we think they are at the moment. Thank you.
So I want to briefly talk about what capitalist ideas of sex and gender means concretely. So what happens is, a doctor looks at you when you're born and says, I think this is a boy, or I think this is a girl. You don't get to make a choice, your parents don't get to make a choice, nobody gets to decide it. In fact, a lot of the time, they've decided before you're even born. What they then do is they write something down on a piece of paper. In my case, I always call it a spelling mistake on my birth certificate. That determines how you're treated for your entire life. And it's purely based on this social idea, as you went through, of what sex is, which determines a social idea of what gender is. And it informs on every single aspect of your entire life. And even if you do transition, like, I'm trans, and I'm very, very strongly supported by the SWP, by my family, by my friends, by my colleagues. And still, it informs on the way I live. Even when I feel completely safe all the time, coming out and saying I'm trans, it informs on every aspect of your life. Now, let's look at the counter to that. Imagine a society where you didn't write down F or M on a birth certificate. Imagine a society where we might still have ideas of gender. We might not, we don't know, but we might. But those are determined by what people believe. And you know what? Some people are being raised that way. It's not very common, and they'll still be influenced by ideas of capitalist society, but where they are, I'll tell you what, there's a lot more non-binary people out there than we think.
1 minute, come on.
Thanks. And they're a lot happier. The gender identity is exists within capitalist society because the system said it does. They force these identities upon us, and even though we can take them to heart, we should be fighting for a society where those gender identities, whether they exist or not, do not determine anything about your life experience. You determine that yourself, and we as workers will control our own lives. That's the most important thing. When it comes to trans liberation, when it comes to liberation of the working class, it's about realizing our own destiny, realizing our own decisions and destiny and things like that. And in which case, a world without gender roles, or at least gender expectations, of course it's going to be better. It's going to be fucking fantastic.
So I would like to take the comrade on the right and then follow the comrade in the centre there. That's okay.
Sorry, my bad.
Hi, yeah, I'd just like to say something quickly about this idea of sort of safe spaces for women, because I think it's really been hijacked by the right and transphobes, really. From my experience, the idea of safe spaces for women, especially in university, was because women were scared of being raped and sexually harassed by their male students. And that's where the argument came from. And it was something that wasn't being addressed by the college authorities or university authorities. And then suddenly that's kind of turned on its head. And I think the right are very good at taking our slogans, our kind of campaigns, but turning them on their head and turning them into something that is actually, it's anti-trans, but it's actually anti-women, because actually those issues are still not addressed on campuses about the levels. It's all about women being sensible and not going out drinking. It's not about saying, hey, men, keep your hands off, keep your hands to yourself, basically. Don't rape women, etc. So, you know, I think we have to be really careful about where, how the right use some of these arguments, which, you know, they say it's about protecting women, but actually it's just totally and utterly reactionary. It doesn't address any of the issues that women suffer today.
I just wanted to say that I think that the fact that, I think under socialism everything is going to change, and sex, gender is going to change too. I think if we have an undifferentiated education for everyone, I don't think gender is going to exist anymore, unlike socialism and maybe communism. So I think it could raise a lot of questions in 100 years or maybe 5 years. No, but a lot of questions are going to be raised, especially about also homosexuality, because what does it mean, like, and heterosexuality too? What does it mean in a society where there's no gender? And yeah, I think in socialism, under socialism, there are going to be a lot of questions that we cannot imagine today, and that's going to be great.
Thank you, comrades. I'm going to take the comrade on the right, followed by the comrade in the master's there.
Thank you. Just the comrade who said, what would happen if we weren't, conditioned and everything else. I think, well, we simply don't know, but I agree with you. I think it will be bloody brilliant. And I think that sense of the whole thing, the pink and blue and what happens. Number one, pink and blue is actually a recent invention. It used to be the other way round. So there's nothing natural about women being pink. Though I'm quite fond of pink, but that's beside the point. But I think that sense of, the experiments have shown that even a pregnancy bump is treated and talked to in a different way once if people have found out the sex of that of the pregnancy. And actually the pink and the blue and all the reference to that only really grew up when people were able to find out in advance, because most of the time, for most of history, people didn't know what the baby's going to be, and therefore it's an absolutely capitalist-driven thing. So you can buy all of these pink things in advance now because you can find out the gender of your child. So it's all built in, and I think that it'll be. I think hopefully we'll have a revolution before 100 years, but I think it will take several generations after a revolution for people to have grown up in a place where they've not had all of these expectations on them. Which I think is very hard to shed it. We all as revolutionaries want to shed it, don't we? We don't want to be the woman who's always thinking, has everybody got a cup of tea, and being the only woman in the office who organises the birthday card. There's always all of these sort of, stereotypes, aren't there, you try and break out of. But at the same time, that sense of possibilities. And I'll just say one other thing, that it's never really been utterly gender divided, the expectations of women. When you look back to Victorian times, women were seen as weak, and they would faint on the chaise longue if, they didn't get an invite to a ball or something. But at the same time, working class women were down the smallest seams of the mines because they could fit into them, and they were growing during 14-hour days. So let's not pretend that class doesn't come into
this as well, and has historically done. So the natural things about women have something that's absolutely changed over the time already, and let's hope we can have a world where, as you say, it doesn't even exist at all. Thank you.
I'd like to take the comrade just in front of the mask, followed by the comrade just on the left there. Well, or right, depends which way.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow on from that in terms of achieving the vision that about living in a world where there aren't gender divisions, and I think it's really important the way we see in which that is tied up with the withering away of the family. Because the real reason why there is such a deep, entrenched division created inside society is because capitalist society depends on the reproduction of the working class through the family, and who is at the centre of the family? It is women, and I think it is important to see that the way in which we will move to a society where it really doesn't matter what your mix of hormones and gonads and all the rest of it are, and how you express yourself, can come about and only come about as part of a process where the bringing up of children is socialised, where in fact it becomes of social concern that children are brought up by society, that we have the creches, that we have the nurseries, that we have the communal eating facilities, that we completely transform living facilities, so that actually we become people, we become individuals, and therefore children are actually growing up, brought up, well, how we don't know exactly how that will work, but actually will be brought up in a communal society and a collective society in which people will be, it will be people's individual abilities which will be nurtured and developed and positively looked on, and not a question of fitting you into boxes. And one of the things I find really most disappointing, having been, grown up in the 60s, when we actually were fighting against a particular kind of gender role. My generation were actually fighting to be able to have short hair, not wear makeup, be able to wear trousers, and actually break out of the stereotype of what it was to be a woman, to find that there are a layer of women, and I gather they're organising inside the Labour Party now to put forward their stance inside the Labour Party, who actually have retreated from that position of smashing up gender boundaries and opening up the spaces for, ultimately, for the withering away of the notion of gender itself.
So I'd like to take the comrade in the glasses, followed by the comrade just at the back in the red scarf.
Hi, so I think what I'd like to say is just a comment about the intersectionality between the fight for trans rights and feminism. In that it's interesting the way in which capitalist patriarchy seeks to control women's bodies is interesting in the way that generally you only hear reactionary and right-wing messaging about trans women, and they regularly seem to forget that non-binary and trans men also are trans and don't seek to exert the same levels of control over them. And that's, I think, interestingly trans-inclusionary, because in that instance they want to control women and are including trans women in that, within that. But, so I think we need to be careful as well to make sure that within our own circles as progressive, we're not only discussing trans rights as far as they pertain to women, but also including non-binary and trans men there as well. So not just falling for the trap that's being set for us. I think the other thing I'd like to say is it's interesting in terms of that level of control that is being sought to be exerted is when it comes to a subject like passing, so whether or not you're able to sort of convincingly show the physiological appearances of the gender that you identify as, that's something that particularly trans women get accused of some level of deceit, for example, whether they pass or whether they don't. If trans women, for example, don't pass, then that usually results in criticism being levelled at them for looking too masculine. But even if they do pass, there are issues such as the legal trans defence, the trans panic defence even, that says that if you're in a bar and you're having a lovely conversation with someone and then it turns out later on that despite you both getting on famously, that person identifies as trans, you are then legally allowed to basically commit violence on that person. So I think that's another case where, because of the way in which society likes to specifically control and gatekeep what women are allowed to look like, we're also extending massively that same expectations onto trans women. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to take the comrade at the back in the red, followed by our last contribution, which is the team T-shirt with the great hair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On the projection there was the word woman was written up, and it's just notable that in Old English, the word man, M-A-N-N, could apply to both male and female, and later had the word W-I-F prefix added to denote gender. But Old English has lots of things like about gender, like inanimate objects can be male or female, like the moon is masculine and the sun is feminine, and some other cultures see it the other way around. But we've sort of dropped all that, so. But the main thing I wanted to talk about was gender roles. I don't know if anyone, the oldest hunter burial found in the Americas, north or south, is known as the Willamaya Petitza girl, and she died and lived 9,000 years ago, and she was definitely a hunter. And then there's a book called Female Hunters of the Early Americas, published by the University of California in 2020, that looked at 500 burials from the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, concluding that 30 to 50% of big game hunters in America were female. The oldest female burial in Indonesia is known as Bersek, who lived and died 7,000 years ago, was also female. She was buried with her hunting weapons and bones of animals that were known to have been hunted at the time. Of course, there are many cultural things in Europe that refer to female hunters. The oldest hunter deity known, Artemis, in Mycenaean Greek, is female. And in the Roman writer Tacitus' book called Germania, published in 98 CE, he refers to hunter-gatherers living by the Baltic. He says of these that women join the hunt alongside the men and claim an equal share of the kill. So I don't think the gender roles in the past. It's the same with warriors. In 1988, there was a Scythian warrior burial uncovered in Tuva, then in the Soviet Union. It was always thought to be male.
1 minute comment.
Sorry, always thought to be male until recent DNA analysis shows it was female. And since 2019, several hundred female warrior graves have been found in the area that used to be occupied by the Scythians, showing that gender roles in the even we call the Amazon River the Amazon, because when the conquistador led by what was his name, De Orellana, went up there, his military force was attacked by women warriors, causing him to remark that this was a river of Amazons, after the Amazons Greek legend, which is why the name has stuck. So anyway, I won't go on too long, but it's just about the gender roles haven't always been like they are now. They've been very, very different. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this sort of biological determinism that comes from the far right, which I think is really on the rise at the moment, and we need to be very wary of, and I think has really contributed to the rollback in women's rights, particularly in America. The reason that this ideology is fundamentally stupid is, first of all, because there is, in terms of feminism, no ideal way to be a woman through that sort of lens. If you are hyper-feminine, then you're a whore. If you're not hyper-feminine, then you're unattractive. You're not feminine enough. If you're, conventionally attractive, there's something wrong with you. If you're charismatic, you're also a whore. If you're not charismatic, you're boring, you're ugly. There's no way to be correct in that way. And the thing I just wanted to share an anecdote, which is, I'm sure people know Ben Shapiro, who is a right-wing populist. But I actually recently saw a clip where he was talking about his son, and he said that his son wanted to wear his sister's glittery pink shoes, and he told him that he can't do that and it's for women, and he just changed his mind right away, and that just shows how liberals are wrong. And it's like, well, no, Ben Shapiro, I think your son just wants to wear glittery shoes, and it totally rolls back everything that you think, that this is for girls and this is for boys. The other thing I wanted to say is that I think a way of winning this sort of fight is saying to cis people, to men, to people who maybe don't typically become part of this conversation, that it is actually liberation for them if we go forward with this form of thinking. Men will be allowed to dress how they like. Men will be allowed to express themselves how they like. There won't be, conscription would be far less gendered. It won't be about being violent or being incredibly sexual, you know. I think actually a lot of the time young men specifically are really, really injured by the way that they are viewed sexually. You know, you feel like you have to be incredibly sexual, you have to have sex all of the time. And I think that's actually very damaging for a lot of young people. So I just think that this whole gender ideology benefits everyone. It doesn't just benefit the people that are oppressed by it, you know, outwardly. That's what I want to say.
So I wanted to follow on from what the person said right before the last person said about gender roles. And I think that they got things right about the importance of allowing for expression in gender roles. But I also think that perhaps the larger point that he was saying about, I don't think gender is special as well. It's particularly important instantiation of a larger problem of being allowed to be who one is. So it's not just a matter of, you know, literary shoots, it's also a matter of what books one wants to read and what one wants to think and all these things. And so I think that gender, instead of being seen as a separate problem, should be seen as a larger instantiation of how we can best allow people to be who they wish to be, in sort of positive liberties of the living sense. And I think we sort of distill the conversation point about gender, we miss the larger point that gender is nothing more than our instantiation of this larger point of who we are. And I also think that to allow that problem to be fixed, we can't just force society or force each other to stop imposing identities on us, because, you know, I've had hundreds of identities forced on me by society, also by my friends, and by my family, and by even by the books I read, all these things. They all force identities. And the only thing that we can do to avoid it is sort of, you know, be oppositional to the identity forced on us, and to inculcate a culture of opposition to identity in other people as well. And so I don't think that the answer here is to stop, is necessarily to stop gender roles per se, but rather to stop the wholesale acceptance of things forced upon us.
Thank you, comrade. Now I'll hand back to Sue for the final wrap-up.
Okay, great. Thanks, comrades, and thanks for the contributions. I don't really have a lot to add to any of the individual contributions, because I thought they were all, you know, really good contributions and interesting and interesting points to raise. The question that the comrade raised about trans women versus trans men and non-binary people is a very relevant one, really. I mean, Julia Serrano talks a lot about trans misogyny, and she writes quite a lot about that in her books, and it's quite interesting the way in which it is women in particular are targeted. And actually, if you think about it, the logic of the gender critical position would be that a trans man who passes ought to be able to go into a woman's space. But we know what happens, don't we, if somebody who is dressed like a man goes into a woman's space, because that is exactly the phrase that we used in the recent case of the Brighton refuge, where the woman didn't want to be there because there was somebody who, quote, dressed like a man in the room. So, you know, I think that the way that question runs into it, of course, because it is always women that are the targets of what they say, and it's riven through actually with those kinds of gender stereotypes, which we really ought to be challenging. I didn't have time to go a lot into the question of the family, so I'm glad that other people did kind of fill that in a bit, and you know the way in which everything is riven through with class, because it's quite interesting, isn't it? Really, because. You know, capitalism claims that the family is the sanctity for us. It's the centre of our society. It's what gives us stability. It's what allows society to function and so on. We're the party of the family. I mean, both the Tory party and the Labour Party will say this. And then you look at the way in which society operates. You know, are they the party of the family for refugees who are trying to come to this country from war-torn places and poverty, where people are forced to leave behind some of their children in a foreign country because they cannot get the right travel documents, or because those children might be loaded into basically death trap boats trying to cross the channel. This is what the party of the family do to those families. The party of the family is the family that cuts benefits, that cuts social services, that cuts all the things that fails to provide decent housing for people. This is the party of the family. It's actually a party that even a government and a society and a system that even within its own terms doesn't actually allow the family to operate in the way in the way that it should. And it is true that ultimately, of course, the reason that we have the family is the role that it plays in terms of the provision of the next generation of labour and so on, and how we should really start to think about how society could be different if we think about collective ways to look after the very young, the very old, the sick, and so on. I think this would not only enable us all to live much freer lives, but also to rid us of the gender stereotypes that arise from within the family system. But it's also true, isn't it, that it provides a lot of ideological ballast for society, because when things do fall apart, when the cost of living does go through the roof, when everything does look terrible, oh, well, it's your fault, it's the feckless father that ran off. It's the single parent mum who didn't look after her kids properly, and so on and so forth. So I think there are all sorts of ways in which it's really important that we talk about how do we completely restructure and organise what we think of as the family. The question of a gender-free society, what will it look like? I think what people have said, we don't really know, but it's going to be bloody great. But what's really important is that we absolutely must fight for it. It's something that we really do need to fight for. And, class very much comes into the fore then. And I think, what people said about how things can get better, how you can win arguments. We can win these arguments. Fighting for that society in the first place means that everywhere we are able to, over the question of trans rights, of gay rights, of same-sex marriage, of abortion rights, of racism and so on, everywhere that we can, we take on the arguments around oppression that attempt to divide our class and so on. And the question of biology as destiny, something that really the feminist and women's liberation movements have always challenged. And for us, you see, I was actually thinking about it, that yes, we reject the idea that biology is destiny in terms of we're defined by how we're born and so on. But actually, in a sense, I believe that we are fighting to fulfil our biological destiny as human beings. If you think about it, how can we really fulfil the full potential of our bodies and our brains? Can we utilise them to create a world where I think we will be astounded at the different ways that we can live and love and be ourselves? Be at peace with our bodies, be at peace with each other, and be at peace with nature and the environment.